If you are an occupational therapy professional who works with autistic people, you've likely heard of strengths-based practice. But does this approach work? And if so, what are the benefits? This week on the podcast, we are discussing a scoping review that explores these questions. And we'll see that strength-based interventions are linked to positive social engagement, learning, self-advocacy, and anxiety reduction. After we review the article, we're delighted to welcome the article's lead author, Kavitha Murthi, MSOTR FHEA. She and I will discuss the practical implications of this research for OTs. So let's dive in. Welcome to the OT Potential Podcast, where we review new and influential OT-related journal articles and pull out actionable takeaways that you can implement in your practice starting today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Lyon, OTRL. And before we dive into this topic of strength-based OT for autistic people, I wanted to let you know that this podcast may qualify as continuing education for you. You are probably listening to this podcast on a free podcast platform. But to gain CEU credit, you will need to be a member of the OT Potential Club, our OT evidence-based practice platform. As of this recording, it is just $89 to join and earn CEU credits, so I highly encourage you to join us in there. But bearing in mind that this could count as a CEU course, I wanted to state our 2 learning objectives so you can be thinking about them throughout the podcast today. Our first learning objective is you will be able to recognize strength-based assessments OTs can utilize with autistic clients. Our second is that you will be able to identify the components of a strength-based approach to OT intervention. So let's begin by looking at our journal article, and then we'll bring on Kavitha to discuss how this research could play out in your practice. The article that we're reviewing today is called Strength-Based Practice to Enhance Mental Health for Autistic People, a scoping review. It comes to us from the American Journal of Occupational Therapy, and it was published in 2023. And I do have this disclosure from Kavitha that I'm going to read for us before I dive into the content. She shares that this article uses the identity-first reference autistic people. This non-ableist language is a conscious preference as it is favored by autistic communities and self-advocates. That being said, the authors respect individuals who use person-first terminologies. So in the introduction to this article, the authors take us back a little bit and talk about the historical focus of autism research and clinical practice. Historically, autism research and clinical practice guidelines focus on understanding the ways people with autism differ from the general population, and then working to remediate those differences. This reflected a medical model assumption that differences are deficits, and that these deficits by nature interfere with an autistic person's quality of life, functions, or skills. Then in the intro, they go on to talk about why this focusing on deficits is problematic. We now know that many autistic people face co-occurring mental health conditions. In our show notes, I'll share an article that indicates that 70 to 95% of children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder have at least one co-occurring psychiatric disorder. So with this in mind, it's important that autism spectrum disorder interventions are designed to enhance mental health, well-being, and quality of life. This is where deficit-focused interventions become problematic, as they entail a constant focus on challenges which can negatively impact overall wellness. Given the problems with a deficit-focused approach, there has definitely just been this cry for change. The autistic community is increasingly supporting the position that differences are not always deficits. Instead, they view the way autistic people differ from the general population as neutral variations or even strengths. In line with this perspective, the autistic research community stresses the need to move away from the goal of changing autistic people's behavior so that it matches that of non-autistic people. And this is where strengths-based practice comes in. In strength-based models, strengths fall into the following areas of competence: vocational, leisure, relational, and/or participatory. Instead of seeing the challenges faced by autistic people as pathologies, strength-based practice models view challenges through a lens that reframes individual characteristics and examines environmental barriers. To wrap up this introduction, the authors share an example of authentic strength-based practice. So in a model that is not strengths-based, practitioners often identify an autistic person's strengths and interests solely to use them as rewards for engaging in non-preferred activities. The article provides the following example of manipulating strengths as a reinforcer versus engaging in true strength-based practice. So their example is that by means of an interest inventory, a therapist learns that using a flight simulator is the student's favorite activity. In a model that is not authentically strength-based, this interest is used as an extrinsic reinforcer. For example, a behavioral plan is set up that requires the student to accomplish a goal in mathematics in order to earn time on the flight simulator as a reward. In authentic strength-based practice, the interest of flight simulators is incorporated into learning mathematics. For example, calculating miles, time, amount of fuel used, and speed to destination. In this way, non-preferred aspects of mathematics can be taught using the student's depth of knowledge in this specific area. So with this great introduction to strength-based practice, we now head into the intent of the specific scoping review. The authors share that strength-based practice is becoming more established in both research and practice. However, there are still gaps in the research that must be identified and addressed. To this end, this particular scoping review aimed to do two things. First, develop an operational definition for strength-based practice, enabling subsequent organization and classification of strength-based research. And secondly, to present the evidence supporting strength-based practice as a means of enhancing outcomes and mental wellness for autistic people. So to begin with, they started with this first goal of operationalizing strength-based practice. The authors analyzed the content of a paper that I'll share in the show notes, and they used this analysis to define three critical components of strength-based practice. The first critical component is to presume the competence of autistic people by focusing on their strength rather than emphasizing their deficits. Use autistic strengths constructively instead of coercively or as a reward to incentivize preferred behaviors. The second critical component is to collaborate with autistic people in research and in practice by leveraging participatory methodologies. And the third is to create a supportive environment that maximizes the strength and interests of autistic people. Supportive environments include, but are not limited to, sensory, social, attitudinal, and physical environments. So they outlined these components of strength-based practice, and then they used this to carry out their scoping review. The articles that they found were categorized into 4 groups: intervention studies, descriptive studies, exploratory studies, and commentaries. Expertise and insight from Dr. Stephen Shore, an autistic self-advocate and the third author of this study, was incorporated at every stage of the review process. I'll let you read more details about their methods in the paper itself, and for our purposes here, we're just going to dive right into the results. So in the results, the authors identified 38 studies representing 3 major themes. 1 was mental health outcomes, 2 was increased knowledge and skills in areas of interest, and 3, creation of supportive environments that nurture strengths and interests. So let's briefly look at all 3 of these themes and begin with mental health outcomes. 2 positive mental health outcomes were associated with strength-based practice. The first was reduced anxiety and stress, and the second was improved self-advocacy skills. All of the intervention studies covering this theme, which was 9 of them, show that strength-based practice reduced social anxiety, alleviated stress, and increased well-being. Furthermore, in 6 of the 9 intervention studies, participants improved their social skills when their interests were used as a medium. And finally, 2 intervention studies involved programs leveraging participatory collaboration, and these studies engaged autistic professionals to foster self-advocacy, self-efficacy, and a sense of accomplishment among their clients. Okay, so that second major theme that I mentioned was increased knowledge and skills in areas of interest. Within the second major theme, there were two sub-themes. One was skill acquisition and enhancement. The second was creation of assessments and interventions that value and incorporate strengths into practice. 5 of the 9 intervention studies and 7 of 10 exploratory studies focus on expanding participants' skills in areas of interest. 5 descriptive studies focused on developing or incorporating strength-based assessments. And that third and last big theme was the creation of supportive environments that nurture strengths and interests. 6 intervention studies emphasized the development of a safe and nurturing environment as a critical component of strengths-based practice. So, headed into the discussion then, the authors discuss multiple implications of this research. I definitely encourage you to read this section in full if you're interested. And I want to highlight that the role of OT in strength-based practice is really prominent throughout this discussion. Before they dived into the 3 main themes from the results, the authors made an important call out about language. They noted the increased use of non-ableist language or neutral terminologies, which describe strength without purporting a negative connotation. This preferred language includes the following terms: focus interests, passions, intense interests, preferences, favorites, abilities. The words I just mentioned can replace judgment-laden and ableist terms such as special interest, circumscribed interest, perseverations, restricted interests, or repetitive interests. So to close this out, I want to share their discussion on those 3 main themes that I mentioned from the results. The first being mental health outcomes and the role of OT. Evidence from this review indicate that strength-based practice greatly improved mental health among autistic participants, specifically by reducing stress and social anxiety. Autistic people often have a lower quality of life due to social isolation. Considering that suicide is the leading cause of mortality among this population, supporting their mental health is crucial. Occupational therapy practitioners' unique skills in delivering evidence-based mental health interventions is not used optimally in the current OT practice environment. Strength-based practice could help these practitioners better meet the mental health needs of the autistic community. That second theme was skill acquisition and expansion. This review emphasized that when autistic participants use their strength in activities that were interest-driven, they enhance their skills. Learning to channel their abilities could instill early career skills, which is critical considering that autistic people experience a higher than average rate of unemployment. And that last theme was environmental supports, and they talk about the social model of disability and the role of OT here. More than half of the studies in this review focused on developing safe environments. This aligns with a social model of disability. Rather than viewing individual differences as deficits, this model holds social contexts accountable for not accommodating these differences. Occupational therapy practitioners are adept at using person-environmental models to align a person's capabilities with the characteristics of their environment. Matching a person's capabilities with their environment in a way that incorporates their autistic strength and interests could ultimately lead to workplaces where the unique talents of autistic people are recognized and appreciated. Okay, that is our review of the article. And as you can tell, there is just a lot to unpack in this research. And we're really just talking about this big paradigm shift in how we think about occupational therapy and our role as occupational therapy professionals. So to walk us through this, I am so thankful to have one of the authors of this study, Kavitha Murthi, join us on the podcast. Kavitha is pursuing her doctoral studies at NYU Steinhardt in the Department of Occupational Therapy. Kavitha currently works with Vice Dean Christy Patton on a National Science Foundation project titled Developing Abilities and Knowledge for Careers in Design and Engineering for Students on the Autistic Spectrum by Scaling Up Making Experiences. Through this project, she intends to explore the impact of interest-driven and strength-based engineering activities on autistic students' learning and social development. Kavitha is particularly interested in understanding how neurodiverse adolescents problem solve independently when engaged in interest-driven tasks. Kavitha firmly believes research must be done with participants and community members. She incorporates participatory approaches to seeking answers to questions that are meaningful to the autistic community. Before starting her journey at NYU, Kavitha completed graduate studies in occupational therapy in the UK and completed her undergraduate studies in occupational therapy in India. Kavitha has experience working with a diverse population of children with developmental disabilities in Mumbai and Edinburgh. Kavitha has also contributed to various national and international research projects, the most notable being the Global Cooperation on Assistive Technology within the World Health Organization through her nomination with the World Federation of Occupational Therapists in 2019. Kavitha was also inducted into the Higher Education Academy of the UK in 2020. So without further ado, I will patch Kavitha into this podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Kavitha. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm so excited.
This is such a meaningful topic to me. I was walking around the block as I was getting ready to talk to you, and just remembering back to when I was in OT school at NYU, and Christy Patton was my professor who's a co-author on this paper. And she was really, I think, just engaging with this strength-based paradigm. And so just to have that happen about 10 years ago, and now fast forward a decade, and we see this amazing, compelling research coming out. And I just feel so honored to be an OT at this time and be part of this paradigm shift that's happening. So, but before we talk about all that, I want to learn more about you and your story. And let's start with how you first found OT.
That's a great question. And I've been thinking about that, like just going back to when I wrote this paper, and also to go back to the starting point of when I actually got into OT. So I grew up in Mumbai, India, and I had a couple of friends, a family member who I've grown up with and seen very closely as they grew up. And they had what we used to call at that point, like behavioral challenges and things like that. And, the schools, and they were labeled as this student has this challenge, this person has this challenge. I never understood why it was, because at the backside, because they were my friends, I knew that one of them had lost their brother or sister, I don't know which sibling, but they'd lost someone in their family, and that sort of came in. And then there was this other child that I grew up with who had epilepsy and, seizure related challenges. And that sort of came up to behavior and other kind of challenges, which sort of made them difficult to be around or work with or teach and things like that. And just because I knew them more personally, I knew that they were fantastic artists, amazing at, basketball or cricket. We play cricket in India, so that's something. And then there's one of my friends, she was great. She's an excellent swimmer. So, things like that I knew because I was close to them. I knew them. I grew up with them. But on the surface, if you just look at them in a different environment where their strengths were not appreciated, they looked at as people who had a lot of challenges. And for me, what I felt growing up was that this has to change somewhere. This has to sort of what can I do about it? And then I forgot all about it because I went into the times of learning and, studying and so on and so forth. And when I came to this cusp of choosing what I want to do for the rest of my life, I really wanted to see if there is something where I can help people in a meaningful way, but which is not like the traditional medicine, like we call it MD, and medical, pre-med school and medical school and things like that. So I wanted to try to see if there's something else that exists out there where you can actually work with people and help them to show who they truly are. And that was just an abstract idea at the top of my head. And I did great in my, we have this end of high school. For us, that's the turning point. That's where you sort of branch into engineering or commerce. You go into things like economics and, all those fields are policies and politics. So we have those branches in India where you sort of have to choose, and then you stick on to that during your undergrad and postgrad if you decide to do it. And everyone told me, like, my dad is an engineer. I got great grades in math. So everyone was like, become an engineer, do what your dad does. And my dad was so happy about it too. And then I was like, that's when this thought came back to me. And I was like, you know what? I love this engineering and it's great. It's fascinating. But I want to do something where I actually go back and help people. And my mom was like, I don't even know if there's a course like this. And then I was like, why don't you? And then I sent her on a mission, sent my dad on a mission, sent my brother on a mission. It's like, all of you guys are going to search this for me. And I'll search myself as well. And then I came across, like, my mom's friend's daughter was enrolled in an undergraduate OT program in Mumbai. And she was like, hey, there's something called occupational therapy, and there you help people become independent in whatever their life goals are. And that's all she said. And I was like, okay. And her mom was like, but you also, like, work in a hospital and you also get the title of a doctor. And I was like, why would I get a title of a doctor? I had no idea. There was this confusion because there's still some challenges related to, like, identity of OT in India as it is. But I was like, okay, let's go look at what this is. And then I go into the university to get my, like, admission, enroll myself in the course. And that's when I said, like, you know what, I'm doing all this, but I need to go back and read up about it. So this was like 10 years ago, just shows how old I am. But going back, went and did some research and actually, like, really liked the way, texts were written. And all those texts were from the US, were from UK. So I was like, oh, okay, what about, like, what do we do in India? And so I felt like, you know what, I should take this up, see what it is, because I love the writings. I love what is written. I love that this helps people get back to meaningful life goals. I didn't know a lot of those words and what it meant for me, what it meant for the people that I'm going to serve. But at that time, I just made up my mind and I was like, you know what, I have to take this plunge. I have to jump in and see what it is. And then we'll figure it out. And then a lot of people in Mumbai used to say, like, oh, but you can do occupational therapy and work as a physical therapy. And I'm like, why would I do that? Like,
Yeah.
And as I studied, that question sort of stayed on with me. And that helped me, like do my undergraduate, come out, and then think that, oh my God, there's a lot of things that I need to change in the way OT applies to the Indian context. And that's when I felt like, you know what, I have to go do this master's in the UK. And I went to the UK and did my master's, learned a lot about theory, models, conceptual models, frameworks, and all those things. And felt that, oh, there's a lot of scope and potential that OT has. It's just that we need to make it more applicable instead of importing those values directly to the Indian context. And with that knowledge, I felt like that was the best 5 or 6 years that I practiced, broadened that knowledge from the texts, the theories, understood them better, but also made them more applicable to the people that I work and the people that I serve. And that sort of, then it was like a calling. Then I'm like, yep, I'm not going to change this profession at all. This is, like, crystal clear. I want to do this and keep doing this for the rest of my life.
I love hearing your story, and it just, to me, connects so strongly to the strength-based approach that we're going to talk about, where I'm like, OTs just tend to have a delight in people, and we come into this profession because we want to spend time with people and we see their strengths, just like you did as a young person. So this approach that we're going to talk about just, to me, feels like such a natural extension of who we are. And I love how your, like, backstory kind of sets us up to talk about this. So, okay, so you go to the UK. I'm curious, how do you get to the US, and where's this interest in working with autistic people come into play? Was that early on, or where does that come into the story?
That's a great question. And I feel like I purposefully sort of left that blank over there so that I can talk more about it. So when I started working as an OT, my first, so we have 4 years of OT training as an undergraduate program, where you sort of learn in different rotations. We call that fieldwork rotations. And we do that along with when we are learning, because it's a longer program. So we have time to go in and practice right from when we are in our second year of occupational therapy undergraduate studies. And as a mom now on the other side, I'm like, wow, this is like the best feeling that you can help other people get if the kid has some challenges and things like that. So I was immediately sort of drawn to pediatric OT when I was in Mumbai. And then once I finished my undergraduate studies, we have these 6 months of like mandatory fieldwork rotations where we are placed in different parts of either an acute care hospital setting, or we go in and work in rural or community settings. So when we were doing that, I was actually placed in a rural setting, which was an orphanage, but we called it the community care center, where children who did not have parents or other sort of challenges were placed in there. And either they could go in for adoption, or then they would be like, once they become an adult, they can leave from there and sort of live their lives. So I was placed there for like a month. And at that time, this is a no-cost resource setting, Sarah. So I had to use a lot of my imagination, and therapy looked very different here. So the first day I go in, I see children who are like a little scared, a little worried. Who is this person? And for me, my whole like at that time, and also because I was very naive at that, like 6, 7 years ago, I was like, okay, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to let these kids have a lot of fun. Like, we're going to do things that is going to be fun. And I didn't know that inadvertently I was doing like a group therapy, because I would pull all the kids together, we'll do painting, whatever things that I had, because there are lots of things that are traditionally, I didn't have a swing, I didn't have a ball pit, I did not have standardized assessments to assess and find out what challenges they actually had. But and they had no parents, they had no family members who would give me that back story, that history. So it was very challenging. But then as OTs, we adapt. That's the best thing that we have. So I would go in and we would just keep doing like fun stuff. Like we would have like a paint party. We would have like vegetable cutting sessions to help the kitchen there for the kids to eat. And all these things that were so occupational, so meaningful, and so much fun for the children. And when I left, after a month, I remember these kids like running up to me, and one of them had I don't know if we know about polio and polio related like challenges in their leg. So this kid comes with, he has polio, and one of his legs is sort of like atrophied. I don't know how we say that, like had challenges. He can't use both his legs to weight bear. And he comes up to me and he says like, this is the best thing I've ever done, and you are my best friend. And taking that up and going back home, I was like obviously in tears all the way back. That day, my journey was like fantastic. I had like all mascara all over my face. But that feeling, that sort of like cemented that I need to explore this interest in working with children a little bit more deeply. And then I went to the UK, and there I had this fantastic opportunity to work with young adults. And most of them, it was just like, I think it's just a match made. And like most of them were on the autism spectrum. And my role over there and I was a student OT, so I was not a full-fledged OT because I was doing my master's, and I was also training to get the certification and things like that. So at that point, I was working as a student OT, shadowing an OT, and the whole setting was so beautiful because it was all about independent living. It was all about community living and the occupations that were meaningful for these young adults. And that could mean OT supporting this young adult to reach their volunteering position. Like, they have a job there. You need to help them use public transport to navigate their way and reach to their jobs on time. And that's how sessions look like. And then there was this one young adult who was very interested in stargazing, and we had to make that possible to get him the telescope, set that up. And I was there for that therapy session at 12 in the night with my senior OT super. 12 in the night. Can you believe that? Because it was crazy. I loved it. And I was coming back home early morning at 6 after everything's done. And my roommates were like, what are you doing? Where are you? And I was like, this is the best party I've been to. Because I never did something like this before. Or, watch a movie with them because they wanted to get that experience of going into the theater to watch a movie, to get the tickets. And that's when I started realizing that so much of OT can be done, and so much of what we have as goals can be achieved in these actual real world contexts. And and that way we can help people to do exactly what they want the way they want it. And that's how I found my like sort of like deep interest to work with people on the autism spectrum, because I've had like the most fun learning from them, and also they are so honest and so such amazing teachers that you learn so much from the way they talk, the way they interact, the way they communicate. There's so much to learn over there, and I felt like that was I owe a lot to of my career and my research to them.
Oh, I just love your story so much. I think so much as OTs in the US over the past decade, many of us find strength-based approaches because we were taught behavior
Hmm.
modification approaches,
Yes.
and that just doesn't feel right to us. But it sounds
Hmm.
like you just had this experience where you just naturally found strength-based approaches even before you had the language for it and loved it and got to experience it. And I love those opportunities that you had. And I see definitely the foundations of this paper being laid. So I see this foundation being laid. How then did this paper come about?
That is an excellent question. So you asked me how I moved to the United States, and I sort of realized that I didn't answer that question. So I went back to Mumbai. I was working there for a couple of years, and then I got married, and my husband was in the US. He was working, and he said like, and I wanted to do my PhD. So I was just like thinking, where should I do it? Like, should I go back to the UK, because I know that context. I've been there. I know how the setting is and things happen, or move to this entirely new country and try to learn about it. And so I just went with my strength of adaptable. I'm like, I know that I'm adaptable. I can go, I can do this. I did not know I would end up at New York University. I did not know that's going to happen to me. I just came in and I was like, okay, let's power through.
Yeah.
and and then I read, and as I was reading up about different like mentors, like potential mentors at the time, I just like came upon, Dr. Chrissy Patton, and I was like, I immediately like just like fell in love with what she's doing. And I was like, I have to talk to her. I have to talk to her. And I scheduled this call and I come in. And the first thing I talk to her is like, I'm really interested in your work about strengths. And I'll never forget this. She says that we need as many minds to think about this in the world as needed. So I would want you to apply to this program, and we'll take it from there. And in Christy fashion. And I was like, okay, let's do that. Because she said it's made it seem so easy that, you could do it. And I was like, okay. And then went and got admitted. And this was after I got through in September, the first fall of the PhD program. I meet her on my one-on-one meeting, and she was like, okay, Kavitha, what are you planning to do in this PhD? And I was so nervous. I was like, and I immediately did not want to say that I was doing all these things that I was doing in India. Never spoke about those experiences. Went in and said, I want to do something in this area of like communication. And then she's like, okay. Anything else? And I think she was like trying to tease that out of me. And I said, also the last I wanted to do explore strength-based interventions. And she had this like 2000-watt smile on her face. And she's like, yes, tell me about it. What is your interest? And I was like, wow, okay. And then I tell her about like, I don't know the name for it. And then she gives me, she's awesome. Like, I can tell you this, like we were in a different location, in a different building, having this meeting. And she's like, come on, walk with me. And she walks with me, goes back to her office, opens her locker, gives me these 50 papers. And she's like, go read this and we can talk more about it. And then I go through them, and it took a while though, but then I go through them. And this was like actually like Feb or March 2020. And that's when I said, but I know that they're doing something related to strengths, but I don't know, or I don't know what an intervention should look like. And Chrissy comes back and like, then you have to write a paper to map everything out. And you got to do, and it's just like, that's the natural way to progress. And she says like, okay, go, let's do a scoping review. And I had only read about scoping review in theory, how it looked, and I never knew what it's going to be to actually do this as a first year student. I was like, okay. And then I was like, Christy, will you do it with me? And she's like, of course I'll do it with you. And then there's another wonderful colleague of mine who's also the second author, Dr. Yulun Shen. She was amazing. And Christy helped me put this like dream team. So it was me, Yulun, and Dr. Stephen Shore. And the minute I met him, I was like, wow, so fascinated by the wealth of knowledge that he has and the expertise that he brought into the paper to like also like just expanding my view about this community. And he was like, he's a self-advocate, and he is and that's what Christy said, he's like an international superstar. And he truly was. And he has this like amazing insider lived experience perspective, but at the same time understanding the systemic challenges and the barriers that exist. So bringing that and that knowledge to expand all our ideas about strength-based practice was great. And that's how this paper came about.
Oh, I love hearing how a great paper, I would think, so often starts with a dream team and how that got formed.
Yep.
And I love that Christy like teased out your strengths
Yes.
in those conversations. And that's what I love about the strength-based approach is I see the applicability of it as just being so wide, and it's just a totally different mindset, and one that I think is a easy shift for OTs to make, or even like you, where we're already doing it and we don't have the explicit words for it.
I just want to bring in that thought where Christy said this to me, and now she has that in a paper. No one builds their lives on remediated weaknesses. People build their lives on strengths. And that sort of is going to be my biggest takeaway from this PhD. Just that mind shift in just like life, like looking at everything around you, just using those words. I think that was the biggest, I would say, gift or wealth that she's like sort of transferred to me. Like, and she just said it so casually one day. And I was like, wow, that just like blew my mind. And now you cannot go back to thinking the other way at all. Like once you sort of, appreciate those words.
Yeah, because it's so intuitive, and you can see that in your own life and in the life of clients. And I totally agree. Something I wanted to ask about was definitely underlying the paper was this focus on mental health and talking about that high co-occurrence with autism of having mental health conditions, and why that is another reason why strength-based practice is so important. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that part of the paper. It definitely seemed like an important underlying theme in the paper.
Absolutely. And I love that question. That's a very important question. So when we wrote this paper, we sort of started looking at the core theme of what is happening when an intervention that values people's strengths, that their competence, what happens when we use all those things in practice. What is that one core sort of outcome that we could like point to? And we felt that mental health outcome was the one that stood out through all our intervention studies. And we divided our studies through intervention studies, descriptive studies, which spoke about strengths, people talking about strengths, autistic people, their family members, what it means to be part of a strength-based intervention. And then we had exploratory studies that went in, and I was like, let's go and explore strength-based practice. But the thing that sort of like teased out from all these studies was, and also opinion papers from autistic self-advocates who spoke about strengths and using strengths. The one theme that ran through it was the sort of positive impact that it had on mental health and well-being of autistic clients and autistic service users. And for us, then we went out, and for me, I personally, after this paper was written, I went in and started looking out into this mental health area. Like, how does it and why does it impact mental health of autistic clients and autistic community members when we use their strengths? And what I found out, and there's a lot of like upcoming literature in this area from autistic authors and autistic researchers researching autism, and to their lived experience, when they talk about it, they talk about the fact that, and one community psychologist and an excellent, brilliant researcher's name comes to my mind, that's Dr. Monique Pota, and they talk about the minority stress model, and they talk about how when a majority community sort of puts these challenges of camouflaging, of masking someone's behaviors, like, this is who I am, but now I have to mask it every single time in every single interaction with a society member to be someone that I'm not, adds stress, right? It adds stress. Like if you tell me not to move my hands every time I talk to you, I'm going to be stressed, like, because I'm a I'm a very non-gestural speaker. But these little things, when we do a lot of like social skill and training, behavior modification, what happens is the core of autistic people and what they are, who they are, is sort of like there is this expectation that that needs to be shifted to something that they are not, and that adds stress. And then we do that in the educational setting, we do that in the community setting, every single setting that they are part of. And then the expectation is that when they come out of all this trauma, they have to have these excellent post-secondary outcomes. Why don't they have a job? Why don't they have like education? Why don't they go in and study further? But then you have made them be people that they truly are not. And that is the dissonance that causes the stress, and that doesn't help them like achieve. Like therapy should sort of help you achieve something, but then there's this dissonance that it sort of wants to change them and fix them. And I feel that that's a lot of that is attributed to ableist ways of thinking and knowledge. And ableism sort of like pushes people to all be part of this community where everyone is healthy, everyone is fit, everyone is at the same level of intelligence, everyone is at and that expectation of that community, it's not possible. That ideology is flawed in itself. And coming from India, where ableism is also supported with patriarchy, I learned this a lot as if like in a first person experience, when as a woman, I was not allowed to do this. As a woman, I was not allowed to do that. So you start feeling that what are you allowed to do? What part of this community am I a member of? Because a lot of things don't help me or let me be in a way that I am. And I have to change that core sort of being of myself, which is then what am I doing? How am I going to engage in any occupation optimally and achieve the outcomes that are set out for me in the society? And I felt that that is a very important sort of takeaway from this. And that is why we see that a lot of autistic members of the community have co-occurring mental health challenges like stress, like anxiety, like uh, depression. And this is witnessed in time and time again in studies. And I feel like strength-based practices can sort of help change this in the right way. And I also emphasize that along with strength-based, we need to partner with our service users in a way that is authentic and bring their expertise in when we design all these like interventions or research studies to understand more about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think ableism, like you're talking about, is something that every therapist probably needs to think about and confront in themselves, and to recognize that historically, even when we had good intentions, unintentional harm may have been happening, and to examine that and take ownership of that. And that's part of that paradigm shift. And I'm so thankful we have therapists who have talked so openly about making this transition. Like Christy has written about it, and we have great examples of learning and then doing something differently.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's a big shift for people, and it's hard, and
it is,
but it's important, and we have to do it. So if someone's listening to this podcast and they're like, yes, I want to start moving towards this more strength-based approach, what can that look like in our assessments? And then if you were walking into a treatment, what can that look like there too? So I guess a two-part question: assessment and then treatment. Based on all the research you've done, what are just some practical tips for us in those two areas?
Love that question. Assessment and treatments are the two really important. Like I think those are the bedrocks of what we do as OTs. So when we do an assessment, it's really important to sort of support our assessments, the standardized assessments I'm talking in particular, with that narrative and that descriptive piece, with either from the autistic member of the community or their family members, however, but to find that piece. And then when I say it's like, it's not either or. When we get our descriptive piece from the parents, from the community, whoever this person works with or lives with, the teacher, anyone else, it is also really important to get that descriptive, subjective narration from the autistic person themselves, even if they are like the different levels of communication, even if they are non-speaking. We can find ways to sort of bring in, and I think we are experts of bringing in assistive technology there. And because we have the support of technology, which is getting more and more advanced every single day, we could use that in. And then I have a couple of sort of assessments that sort of look into strengths. And I feel that the AIR self-determination scale is great. And that's something that we found in the scoping review as well, because it helps autistic members like adolescents, young adults, and even children to set goals, make choices for themselves in as parts or as partners in the therapy process. And then there is COSA, the Child Occupational Self-Assessment, which helps identify interests and self-report on strengths. So these touches both those interest areas and strength areas very nicely. And then we have the COPM, which is again self-determined goals, self-endorsed goals to understand the participation in occupations and occupational performance. So very OT driven, but also at the same time very strength based. And then we have the behavioral and emotional rating scale, which looks at interpersonal strengths, family strengths, intrapersonal strengths, what the person feels, and looking at different contexts like schools and careers and things like that. So it brings about that holistic nature. And I also want to point to this study as to why it is really important to bring in this person, the subjective, personal, first person experience into it, because this is brilliant study done by Lauren Kenworthy, and the paper is in Autism, and I can share that with you. And it talks about adding this missing voice to brief. And we all know brief is the behavior scale for executive functions, and it was historically not sort of provided to young adolescents on the autism spectrum to rate themselves as a self-report. And what the researchers did in that area was to give that report to parents, give it to school teachers, and also to the adolescents. I think they were all between the ages of 11 to 15, if I'm not wrong. And all these young adolescents rated themselves on the brief, and it was great to see that it was a match between what the parents said and the areas of executive functions that the parents pointed were challenging for their kids to the self-report of autistic adolescents, as they pointed out. So the area that was noted where most autistic children have challenges was in the area of cognitive flexibility. But what was interesting was the fact that parents rated them to this degree that autistic adolescents didn't rate themselves. They said, we are not having this many challenges. It is because of these other skills. So they provided this insight, this brilliant insight into why there is a challenge in this area. Why did I have this challenge? What was the challenge with the assessment in itself and the way things are reported, the communication strategies that were used to gather that information? So sometimes it's not cognitive flexibility as a problem in executive functions at all. It is just the way the test was administered. If it would be given in a different medium, we could see different changes. And that's the sort of conclusion that came out. It's not just that, even in the intelligence scale, and I think there was a paper, I think in the New York Times or something, that came about where it spoke about the intelligence measures. It was the Wechsler intelligence scale versus the Raven intelligence scale. I'm not getting the right name at this point, but then both those scales, one is a scale that looks or uses communication, like verbal communication. The other one looks at visual strengths. It looks into autistic people's area of strengths, which is visual and visual perceptual skills. And the way students scored was vastly different. There was a huge difference. So that's the reason why we need to get in that voices in. And that can be done. And we as OTs, we have this wonderful tool, which is called occupational profile. Using that and many areas, and in almost all the contexts that I work with, I barely had access to like standardized assessments. But we did assessments with like actual verbal reports from children, actual verbal reports from parents, and trying to see if those match and why, and then bring everyone together and try to talk about, so this is what your child feels, and this is where they feel that their strength is not being brought about. And as you pointed out very accurately before, that many times when the focus is on just fixing a behavior, what happens is what we do in many cases, and that also came about in this study, is that the thing that the child is very interested in doing, the toy that the child is very interested in playing with, is taken away and given back to them as a reward. And when you take away that one thing that, they feel that they are great at, that's their sort of like confidence meter, and you take that away, it becomes hard, and that is where we need to sort of change the focus, and we bring in more narrative, subjective pieces of assessments. We'll understand why that toy is important, why that behavior happens in that area, like why stimming occurs in this particular area, because this environment is really challenging for them. It's very low functioning for that person to function at an optimal level. So instead of like just bringing in like numbers, and I would never sort of diminish the strength of standardized assessment, but instead of just bringing in that subjective piece and adding that missing voice is so important, and that will help us gain this like very different, very new, unique insight as to what the person is actually feeling. And then the intervention starts looking differently. And then when we develop interventions based on that aspect itself, it'll look differently. And then you talked about the actual intervention in itself. And when we do that, once we understand what this child loves, it is, and I think we also give an example. That example was written by Dr. Stephen Shore in the paper itself, that talks about flight simulators. So instead of like telling the child, don't think about flight simulators till this 30-minute session and we have to focus on math, instead of doing that, bring in flight simulators. We can do a ton of math with it. Like, we can see what, I haven't a clue about it, but then in the program that I'm part of, like a research assistant of this program, we bring in engineering interests and we couple that engineering interest with making, which is so occupational driven. Making is, it's been in our history. It's been there everywhere. We talk about making. We talk about using our hands to engage in an occupation that we love. And in this study, it's called the Ideas Maker program. And in that, we bring in engineering as an interest area. We use engineering to teach social skills. So what happens is it's a very interest-driven focus group, and it is a very interest-driven social club. So when students talk to each other, it is an interest-driven conversation. And it is very important to understand that the autistic to autistic sort of peer communication, and my friend Yulin Chen did amazing research in this area, where she looked at the autistic to autistic peer communication and the level of like knowledge transfer between two autistic to autistic peers versus autistic to non-autistic peers and non-autistic to non-autistic peers. And what she found out was that autistic to autistic peers communicate at the same level, at the same rate as non-autistic to non-autistic peers. So it is just that the way they communicate is different. And we see that Dr. Damien Milton, who's again an brilliant autistic researcher researching autism, brought this theory called the double empathy theory. So the understanding of communication, the understanding of knowledge transfer occurs very differently. And as non-autistic therapists, we sometimes don't understand the way autistic people communicate. And then to bring this emphasis on, like, this is how you need to communicate. These rules, that sort of adds an impact. So if you just transfer or change the way that happens, the communication, or pay more attention to bringing their interests in the setting that they are, like, I think the whole sort of therapeutic process changes. And I can give a very quick example. Like when I was in this community setting, and as I told you, it was a very low cost setting. So a lot of things we did not have that a typical OT clinic should have, like swings and this and that, toys and things like that. So what we did was, there was this bunch of like children who loved playing cricket, and most of them were on the autism spectrum. So they would come in, they would quickly like exchange scores on whatever was happening. There was a World Cup happening in cricket at the time. And then they would be all, and there's brilliant social communication, interpersonal skills, psychosocial skill development happening right there. And then they're all pulled into individual sessions away, and things change. Like now you have to say these words. Now you have to focus on this, like this way of social communication, which is not who they were. And then my the director of that community setting decided that instead of having this individual session where we break this wonderful group into like individual sessions, what we could do is we could ask the parents and see if they would be okay for a group session. And the parents loved it. And then we brought this entire bunch of kids to play cricket, and we would take them into a playground. We would play cricket. I suck, but we played well. They taught me so many things about cricket, and there was wonderful knowledge exchange happening at that point. The communication skills developed, the social anxiety reduced, all the things that we talk about, like the eye contact, which is also a part of it, that improved greatly because, and everything sort of looked very different when we brought in that strength. And in many ways, I felt like that was not very authentic because we did not know about it at the point. But as we knew about it, things started changing. And then the group of kids then decided to put up a presentation on cricket and their sort of experiences of how they played, how they learned in front of their parents. And it was such a wonderful afternoon. And the same way in our Ideas Maker program, this is a completely different group in New York City. We use their engineering skills and interests where they are part of a social club. And they come up with such beautiful sort of finished products because the social club focuses on them building engineering products. And they come in and they build it. They build circuits. They build 3D printed robotic items. They do motor activities. And at the end of it, there was this, and I always bring about the student who actually built a 3D printed laptop from scratch using Raspberry Pi all by himself with a group of friends in an after school club. So that is what I feel intervention can look like.
Oh, I just love hearing you talk about this. I can hear the delight in your voice and how you just delight in working with these people. And I love that about the strength-based approaches. It really allows us as therapists to engage with our clients in a new way. I want to say a new way, but also in the way that we thought we were going to when we came into OT. Yes. I'm just thinking about you back in India and learning about meaningful occupations, and that's what you're doing. And so It's a shift, but everything you've talked about, I'm like, yeah, that sounds like OT. That sounds like what I learned in school. Sometimes we just don't get to do that in our practice settings for a variety of different reasons. And this inspires me to ask, why not? Can we bring in these strength-based approaches? Are these actual limitations, or what can we change in our specific setting? I'm going to link to all the assessments, and you mentioned a couple papers. I'll do that too, so people can go back and reference those.
I was just going to say that, as you said, sometimes bringing in this different ideologies of strengths might look like, oh, it's a daunting thing. But then, Christy was talking to me about this school in the United Kingdom where she goes in and she delivers this wonderful, wonderful class on strength-based practice and interventions. It's a semester-long program, but that is delivered in the US, at our NYU campus for 3 months. But in the UK, it's a 1-week program. So it's a deep dive, immersion-based program, and Christy co-teaches the class with Stephen Shore. So it's this wonderful thing where he brings the lived experience, she brings the OT expertise. It's a wonderful, wonderful class. And in that, she was talking to me about this thing that the UK school does, which is, apart from setting goals, the regular goals, adding this one goal on the top, which is called the aspirational goal. And the aspirational goal can be anything that you aspire, whatever you want to do. It could be I want to sing in front of my class, or I want to, do this presentation in front of my friends. And that is something that can be easily sort of brought into our therapeutic setting, no matter how sort of restrictive it is in a way, if it follows a certain pattern that needs to be done, we can still bring in this kind of small shifts.
I just can't believe, looking at this approach, how much it's developed over the past decade. The research is so exciting. I wanted to ask, looking ahead into the next 5 years, maybe, where is it going? Can you give us a picture of where the research is focusing? What can we be expecting from this movement?
Love that question. And I was just reading about this paper yesterday, which is from a group of autistic researchers. And they're talking a lot about shifting the terminologies, the way we talk about autism, the way we use language to describe autistic people. And that is probably the first sort of like huge paradigm shift that's going to happen, instead of using terminologies which are sort of restrictive and ableist in its way, like restrictive interests, circumscribed interests, or things like that, to using more sort of descriptive words which sort of talk about the value of that behavior, like focused interest. This person is interested, or just using interest as is, and not adding any sort of value-laden statement or like value-laden word there. And then also when we talk about like the challenges, using neutral language rather than, because a lot of like, there's a beautiful study by Russell, which is a qualitative study. I think there was an autistic researcher in that study as well. It's included in our scoping review. And they talk about viewing abilities of autistic people holistically. Like, we do have our challenges. We are not saying that we don't have challenges. And Dr. Robert Chapman, who's also an autistic researcher, talks like more about that and expands on that. He's like, we don't hate the medical model. We don't do not want the medical model at all. The medical model has its place when it's a medical challenge, but to help sort of practitioners understand when to shift and how to shift is, I think that's where the field is going. Hopefully it goes that the research goes in that area. And I also feel how early career researchers, there's another wonderful paper in Autism in Adulthood, which talks about how early career researchers are already invested in this model of partnership and collaboration and authentic partnership with autistic researchers, and sort of working in partnership to develop research or intervention. And I think as OTs, we are wonderfully sort of positioned in both research and practice. And that's what I wrote in the paper. We are expert clinicians. We work in interdisciplinary teams. That's our strength. We adapt. And I feel like as OTs, we can be the front runners in this entire sort of movement where we bring in, collaborative partnerships. We work with our service users in ways that are more authentic and more participatory. So I feel in 5 years, I would love to see if that happens. And I hope to see that happen.
It's such an exciting time in OT now, and it just makes me so excited to look into the future for sure. And I hear that work that OTs have to do. We have to confront the ableism in ourselves. We have to increase our flexibility of thinking, shifting between different models. And that's a change for us, but such a good change. It's so inspiring. The stories you have told today just showcase why this is so important. And I'm just excited about the future. We're already at the end of our time, but I wanted to for sure hear from you. We talked about so many things today. What's like the closing thought you want to leave us with?
The closing thought that I want to leave everyone with is the fact that we need to, as OTs, our profession is a very powerful profession. It is something that is fundamental to the very existence of human beings, occupations. We all occupy ourselves. So, and that's why, coming from India, I was so humbled to be part of this profession, because I could see that we have so much potency, so much strength in what we do as OTs. And I feel like we need to give that grace, and we need to look at ourselves, at our strengths. And our strength is the fact that we are experts in occupation. Let's not forget that. We may be in different settings, but we bring in this expertise, this unique lens of occupation that I don't think any other profession looks at or brings in. It looks at fixing people. We can look at fixing the occupation and making it more available, accessible to the most marginalized and vulnerable communities in a very sustainable way. That's our strength, I feel. And I think we should go back to that, or go to that if we have not been doing that. But I think all of us, no matter what kind of setting, and as you said, like the traditional setting, be a modern contemporary setting, we all have that focus. We all look at that and to sort of accept that. And I think we should just start believing that, yes, we are the experts in occupation. Just bring that in and start working with that in our mind.
Well, Kavitha, this has been such a meaningful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and then also just the work that you're doing. It's so important and it's so needed, and I'm so thankful that you shared with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And this was such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Wow, you all, this was such an incredible experience to hear the story behind this article and to get a taste of that joy and excitement of shifting to strength-based practice. As we talked about on the podcast, there are small ways and big ways you can start shifting your practice. I'm going to share the assessments that were mentioned in our show notes along with all the articles we talked about. And Kavitha is also sharing a link to a full curriculum called the Ideas Maker Program, which is intended for middle school students. If you are a member of the OT Potential Club, we really want to hear your thoughts and your questions, and we encourage you to hop into the club to share them. You can also rate this episode there. If you would like to earn CEU credit, you can also log into the club to take a test and earn a certificate for your time today. And lastly, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this podcast helps you broaden your knowledge, tweak your practice, and stay evidence-based. Take care, and we'll talk to you next time.